The giant Apache found her freezing in the wedding dress, half buried in snow like a discarded prayer. Her dark skin had turned ashen against the white satin, lips purple as winter berries. He lifted her without ceremony, water dripping from the frozen lace onto his buckskin shirt. "You're coming with me," the words cut through the mountain silence. She stirred against his chest, mumbling something about not being good enough, about being left behind. Her breath came in shallow puffs against the dawn air. Joaquin Delgado had been tracking elk when he found her. Now he carried something more fragile than any wounded animal he'd ever brought home. The woman's weight pressed against his arms. Substantial and real. Her body told a story of rejection, of cruelty he recognized in his bones. The hidden canyon appeared as a crack in the red rock face. Most riders would pass it without notice. Hawk had carved this shelter from stone and silence over 3 winters of exile. The entrance barely allowed his massive frame to pass through. Inside, warmth radiated from banked coals. He laid her on the buffalo hide that served as his bed, then fed the fire until flames danced against the canyon walls. Her wedding dress was soaked through, the fabric cheap and poorly sewn. Someone had sent her west without much care for her comfort. She woke as he was heating water in a tin pot. Her eyes opened wide, taking in the firelight, the stone walls, the tall Apache warrior watching her with quiet concern. Fear flickered across her face like shadow. Where am I? Safe. She tried to sit up, winced as frostbite pain shot through. Her gaze swept the shelter, noting his rifle propped against the wall, the dried meat hanging from wooden pegs, the careful organization of a man who lived alone by choice. "You're Apache." "I am," the words hung between them. She pulled the buffalo hide closer around her shoulders, her dark eyes never leaving his face. Years of mistrust had taught her to read danger in a man's posture, in the set of his jaw. This one stood still as carved stone, but his hands remained open at his sides. "They left me." Her voice cracked on the admission. "Said I wasn't what they ordered." Hawk poured hot water into a wooden bowl, added herbs that would help with the cold. Sickness. He'd seen enough cruelty to recognize its aftermath. The woman's pain sat heavy in the small space between them. "Drink this." She accepted the bowl with shaking hands, inhaled the steam. The warmth seemed to unlock something in her chest, and words began to pour out like water from a broken dam. Her name was Ellie Williams. She'd traveled from Georgia with nothing but a letter promising marriage to Marcus Thompson, a rancher outside Tucson. The letter had been signed with careful penmanship, full of promises about a new life in the territories. She'd sold everything. She owned for the train ticket west. His family took one look at me and said there'd been a mistake. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Said I was too dark, too fat, too much trouble. They kept my dowry money, though. Said it was payment for the inconvenience. Hawk stirred the fire, sending sparks up toward the smoke hole. The injustice of it burned in his chest. White men and their casual cruelties. He'd seen enough of both to last several lifetimes. They put me back in the wagon that brought me from town. Told the driver to take me to the train station. She stared into the herbal tea, her reflection wavering in the dark liquid. But the storm came up fast. Driver got spooked, said he wasn't risking his horses for no colored woman. Just dumped me out there in the snow. The wind picked up outside, moaning through the canyon walls. Hawk had lived through enough frontier winters to know she wouldn't have lasted another hour in that storm. Someone had left her to die as surely as if they'd put a bullet in her chest. Why did you help me? The question came out smaller than she'd intended. He considered this, poking at the coals with a stick. The firelight played across his weathered face, highlighting the scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of his own exile. Because I know what it means to be thrown away. She studied his profile, noting the careful way he moved, the precision with which he tended the fire. There was something deliberate about his solitude, as if he'd chosen this canyon refuge not from fear, but from necessity. "Are you going to hurt me?" "No." The simple word carried more reassurance than any flowery speech. She believed him, though. She couldn't say why. Maybe it was the gentle way he'd tended her frostbite, or the fact that he'd covered her with his warmest blanket while she slept. Hawk rose and walked to the canyon entrance, listening to the wind. His horse nickered softly. From the sheltered alcove where he kept his few animals, something in the sound made him tense, his hand moving instinctively. Toward the rifle. "What is it?" "Company coming." He moved back to the fire, began gathering supplies with practiced efficiency. The woman watched him work, noting the controlled urgency in his movements. Whatever was coming, it wasn't good news. "The white men will come looking," he said, more to himself than to her. "They always do." Outside, the storm continued its assault on the canyon walls. But underneath the howling wind, Hawk's trained ears picked up something else. The distant sound of voices calling out across the winter landscape. Men with purpose, hunting something they'd to find. Ellie pulled the buffalo hide tighter around her shoulders, understanding instinctively that her rescue had only been the beginning. In saving her life, the Apache warrior had bound their fates together in ways neither of them could yet imagine. The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. Outside, the voices grew closer. The voices carried on, the wind like smoke signals. Hawk pressed himself against the canyon wall, listening to their approach. Men on horseback, maybe 6 or 7, calling out across the frozen landscape with the persistence of predators. "Found her tracks leading this way," one voice shouted above the storm. "Can't have gone far in this weather." Ellie's breath caught in her throat. She recognized the voice of Clayton Thompson, Marcus's older brother. The man who'd counted her dowry money while his wife stripped the wedding dress from her shoulders and pronounced her unsuitable for their family. Hawk's hand moved to his rifle. The gesture was subtle, practiced, the movement of a man who'd learned to read danger in the shift of wind through grass. His dark eyes never left the canyon entrance. "They want you back," he said quietly. "Not me, the money they claim I stole." She watched his face for judgment, for the moment when he'd realized keeping her meant trouble he didn't need. Instead, he moved deeper into the shelter, began checking the loads in his weapons with methodical precision. The search party's voices grew closer. Clayton's commands cut through the air, sharp and authoritative. He was a man accustomed to having his orders followed, his problems solved with money and intimidation. "Thompson boys got influence in these parts," Hawk said, more to himself than to her. "Sheriff won't ask too many questions about what happened to a colored woman who stole from white folks." Ellie felt the familiar weight of worthlessness settle on her shoulders. She'd carried it from Georgia, packed it careful as her few dresses, nursed it through the long train ride west. Now it pressed against her ribs, making each breath a conscious effort. "You should give me back to them." The words tasted bitter. "As winter berries, I'm not worth the trouble." Hawk's hands stilled on his rifle. He turned to look at her, his weathered face revealing nothing. But something in his eyes shifted, hardened, the way stone hardens after fire. "Nobody decides your worth but you." The searching voices moved past their position, echoing off the canyon walls before fading into the distance. But Hawk didn't relax his grip on the weapon. He'd survived 3 winters of exile by assuming every moment of peace was borrowed time. Morning came gray and brittle. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape scoured clean by wind and snow. Hawk ventured out to check their tracks, erasing what signs he could with a pine branch. The searchers had made camp a mile downstream, their smoke rising straight up in the still air. When he returned, Ellie was examining his few possessions with the careful attention of someone trying to understand her captor. She'd found his collection of legal documents, Papers written in English that he'd somehow acquired during his exile. "You can read," she said, not quite a question. "Some, not enough." The admission cost him something. She could see it in the way he turned back to the fire, dismissing the subject with forced casualness. But Ellie had been a teacher before circumstances forced her west, and she recognized the hunger for knowledge in his careful handling of the papers. "These are land grants," she said, holding up one of the documents. "Government papers about water rights." His attention sharpened, focused on her with an intensity that made her skin warm. For the first time since he'd found her, she felt useful. Valuable for something other than the dowry money sewn into her dress hem. "My people need to understand these papers," he said finally. "White man's law is changing everything. We need to know what they're taking, what they're leaving us." She studied his face, noting the careful way he spoke about his people. There was distance in his words, the separation of someone who belonged but didn't belong, who served but wasn't served. "Why are you out here alone?" The question hung between them, heavy as smoke. Hawk poked at the fire, sending sparks up toward the smoke hole. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old wounds. "Sometimes you have to leave home to protect it." Before she could ask what he meant, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed through the canyon. A single horse this time, moving with the confident gait of someone who knew the terrain. Hawk was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. The rider appeared at the canyon mouth, silhouetted against the gray sky. Tall and lean, with the easy posture of someone born to the saddle. Apache, but wearing a mixture of traditional dress and white man's clothing that spoke of adaptation, of walking between worlds. "Cousin," the rider called out in accented English. "We need to talk." Hawk's grip on his rifle didn't ease. The man who'd entered their sanctuary moved with the fluid grace of a warrior, but there was something else in his bearing, authority, the quiet command of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Storm Rodriguez," Hawk said, his voice flat. "What brings you to my exile?" Storm's eyes found Ellie, took in her presence with a single sweeping glance. His expression didn't change, but something cold settled in his dark eyes. He dismounted, ground-tied his horse with practiced efficiency. "The council sent me. They're concerned about your new pet." The word hit Ellie like a physical blow. She'd heard it before, along with other terms that reduced her to something less than human. But coming from this man, in this place where she'd begun to feel safe, it cut deeper than expected. Hawk stepped forward, his massive frame blocking the space between Storm and Ellie. The movement was subtle but unmistakable, a line drawn in the dust of the canyon floor. "She's under my protection, your protection." Storm's voice carried the weight of old arguments, old disappointments. "You've been alone too long, cousin. Starting to think with your heart instead of your head." The two men faced each other across the fire, years of shared history crackling between them. Ellie could see the family resemblance now, the similar bone structure, the way they both carried themselves with warrior's pride. But where Hawk's exile had carved lines of solitude around his eyes, Storm wore the burden of leadership. "The white men are asking questions," Storm continued, "offering money for information about the woman. The council says abandon her or face permanent exile, permanent exile." The words fell into the canyon silence like stones into still water. Ellie felt the weight of being someone's burden, someone's impossible choice. She'd run from Georgia to escape being unwanted, only to find herself unwanted again. "I won't abandon her." Hawk's words were quiet, final. Storm studied his cousin's face, reading something there that made his own expression soften fractionally. "Then you choose her over your people." "I choose what's right." Storm mounted his horse with fluid grace, but his eyes remained fixed on Hawk's face. There was sadness in his gaze, the sorrow of watching family make choices that couldn't be undone. "The council won't protect you from this decision, cousin." and they won't protect her." He rode away without looking back, leaving Hawk and Ellie alone with the weight of consequences. The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on the canyon walls. Outside, the sound of multiple horses approached, moving with purpose through the morning stillness. Ellie rose and moved to the canyon entrance, her heart hammering against her ribs. Clayton Thompson sat his horse at the head of 6 armed men, his face grim with determination. He'd found them. "Apache," Clayton called out, his voice echoing. "Off the stone walls. Send out the woman, and we'll have no trouble." Hawk moved beside her, his rifle steady in his hands. But they both knew the truth. 6 armed men against 1 warrior and a woman who'd never held a weapon. The mathematics of violence were simple and unforgiving. "Time to go," Hawk said quietly. They gathered what they could carry, moving with the desperate efficiency of people who'd run out of time. The sound of approaching horses grew closer, and Ellie understood that her rescue had only been the beginning of something larger, more dangerous than either of them had imagined. They escaped through the canyon's back passage, a crack in the stone so narrow Hawk had to turn sideways to navigate it. Ellie followed, her wedding dress catching on the rough walls, tearing free in white fragments that marked their passage. Behind them, Clayton's voice echoed off the rocks, sharp with frustration. The passage opened onto a mesa that stretched toward distant mountains. Wind swept across the flat expanse, carrying the scent of sage and snow. Hawk moved with the fluid efficiency of someone who'd learned to read the land's moods. "To find shelter where none seemed to exist, we need higher ground," he said, scanning the horizon. "They'll track us easy across open country." Ellie's feet were already bleeding inside her thin wedding slippers. Each step sent fire up her legs, but she pressed forward without complaint. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew closer, horses picking their way through the narrow passage. They climbed toward a ridgeline dotted with juniper and pine. The ascent took them above the snow line, where the air grew thin and each breath required conscious effort. Hawk moved ahead, breaking trail through the drifts, his massive frame carving a path she could follow. At the ridge's crest, he stopped. Below them spread a valley she hadn't seen before, protected by steep walls and fed by a spring that kept it green even in winter. Smoke rose from several shelters clustered near the water, and she could see horses grazing in the protected meadow. "Your people," she said. "My people." The words carried weight beyond their simple meaning. She could see the longing in his posture, the way his gaze lingered on the peaceful scene below. This was what he'd been protecting through his exile. This hidden sanctuary where his family could live free from the crushing weight of white expansion. They descended into the valley as the sun reached its zenith. The air grew warmer, sheltered from the mountain wind. Children playing near the stream stopped to stare at the giant Apache and the black woman in the torn wedding dress. Their eyes held curiosity, not fear. An elderly woman emerged from the largest shelter, her silver hair braided with beads and feathers. She moved with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, but her eyes held the warmth of countless grandchildren loved and protected. "Joaquin," she said, her voice carrying across the meadow, "you've brought us a guest." The woman's English was precise, shaped by years of necessity. She approached Ellie with the direct gaze of someone who'd learned to judge character quickly and accurately. Her weathered hands reached out to touch the remnants of the wedding dress, feeling the cheap fabric, the poor workmanship. "White men's bride," she observed. "White men's cast-off," Ellie corrected quietly. Something shifted in the older woman's expression. Recognition, perhaps, or simple understanding of what it meant to be discarded by those who claimed to know your worth. She nodded once, a gesture that seemed to settle something between them. "I am Alana Rodriguez, Storm's grandmother." "You are. Welcome in our home." The simple words carried more weight than any formal ceremony. Ellie felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. a knot of worthlessness that had been growing since Georgia. These people didn't know her story, didn't care about her failures or rejections. They saw only a woman in need of shelter. Over the following days, Hawk began teaching her the skills she'd need to survive in this harsh country. How to read the sky for weather, to identify edible plants, to move silently through underbrush. Her hands, soft from years of teaching school, grew calloused from gathering firewood and preparing hides. Plants tell stories, he said, showing her how to recognize the signs of water, the warnings of poison. You learn to listen. The land will keep you alive. She proved surprisingly quick to learn. Her mind, trained to absorb and organize information, adapted to this new curriculum of survival. Within a week, she could identify a dozen edible plants, predict weather changes from cloud formations, track small game through difficult terrain. But it was her other skills that proved most valuable. In the evenings by firelight, she would read aloud from Hawk's collection of legal documents. The government papers that would determine his people's future, written in language designed to confuse and mislead. This section gives the territorial government authority to relocate tribes, she explained, pointing to a particular clause. But this part requires compensation for improvements to the land. They can't just take your homes without payment. Hawk listened with the intensity of someone whose survival depended on understanding every word. The other adults gathered around the fire, following her explanations with growing comprehension. Knowledge was power, and power was the only thing that might keep them free. You could teach our children, Alina said one evening. Help them understand both worlds. The suggestion hung in the air, heavy with possibility. Ellie had thought. Her teaching days were over, that no one would trust their children to a woman deemed unsuitable for marriage. But here, in this hidden valley, her abilities had value beyond her appearance or social status. I'd like that, she said quietly. The lessons began the next morning. A dozen children of various ages, their faces bright with curiosity, gathered around the fire as she taught them to read English words, to write their names in the white man's script. In return, they taught her Apache words, helped her understand the complex relationships that governed their community. It was during one of these lessons that Storm appeared at the valley's entrance, his horse lathered with sweat. He dismounted quickly, strode toward the fire with the urgent gait of someone carrying bad news. Army scouts, he said without preamble. 2 days ride east. They're asking questions about missing women, about Apache raids on settlements. The weight of his words settled over the camp. Ellie felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the knowledge that her presence brought danger to people who'd shown her nothing but kindness. They're using me as an excuse, she said, claiming you took me against my will. Storm's eyes found hers across the fire. In them, she read the same calculation she'd seen in so many faces before. Was she worth the risk? Was protecting her worth endangering everyone else? There's more, Storm continued. Clayton Thompson is offering a reward. $50 for information about the woman's whereabouts. $100 for proof of Apache involvement in her disappearance. The silence that followed was deafening. $50 was more money than most people in the territory saw in a year. $100 was enough to buy safety, to relocate somewhere beyond the reach of territorial authorities. Ellie rose from her place by the fire, brushing dust from her borrowed Apache dress. The wedding gown was long gone, cut up for bandages and cleaning rags. In its place, she wore the practical clothing of a woman who'd learned to value function over appearance. I should go, she said. Turn myself in before they find this place. No. The word came from Hawk, sharp and final. He stood as well, his massive frame casting shadows across the fire. We don't abandon family. The word hit her harder than any physical blow. In Georgia, she'd been the unmarried daughter, the burden her relatives tolerated out of duty. In the Thompson household, she'd been the mistake, the unwanted package that needed returning. But here, in this hidden valley, she'd become something she'd never been before, someone worth protecting. Elena's weathered hands reached out to touch her arm, the gesture gentle but firm. You belong here now. We don't let family face danger alone. But even as the words warmed her heart, Ellie could see the truth in Storm's eyes. The army was coming, and her presence would make them all targets. Love and acceptance meant nothing if they were dead. The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on their faces. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of distant storms. Change was coming whether they wanted it or not. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Storm returned from his scouting mission with dust on his clothes and worry carved deep in his weathered face. He dismounted near the fire where Ellie was teaching the children their letters, his horse's flanks heaving from hard riding. The army's moving, he announced to the gathered adults. 3 companies heading toward the eastern settlements. They're not just looking for the woman anymore. Elena's hands stilled on the hide she was working, her knuckles white against the leather. The other women exchanged glances, reading the danger in Storm's tone, in the way he avoided looking directly at Ellie. What are they really after? Hawk asked, though his voice suggested he already knew. Our water rights, our land. They're using the missing woman as justification for a full investigation of Apache activity in the territory. Storm's eyes found Ellie's across the fire. Clayton. Thompson has friends in the territorial government. They've been looking for an excuse to relocate us. The words hit the camp like stones thrown into still water. Ellie felt the familiar weight of being someone's burden, someone's impossible choice. She'd fled Georgia to escape being unwanted, only to bring destruction to the first people who'd offered her belonging. How long do we have? Elena asked. Days, maybe less. They're asking every rancher, every trader, every drifter about Apache movements, offering money for information about hidden camps. The children had stopped their lesson, sensing the adult tension even if they didn't understand its source. Ellie gathered the slate boards and chalk, her hands shaking as she tried to maintain normal routines in the face of approaching catastrophe. That evening, after the children had been sent to bed, the adults gathered around the fire for a council meeting. The flames cast dancing shadows on their faces, highlighting the worry lines that had deepened since Storm's return. We could move deeper into the mountains, one of the men suggested. Find another hidden valley, and leave behind everything we've built here. Elena's voice carried the weight of years spent creating this sanctuary. The gardens, the winter. Stores, the graves of our ancestors. Better than leaving behind our lives, Storm countered. The debate continued past midnight, voices rising and falling with the rhythm of the fire. Ellie sat apart from the circle, understanding that her presence had triggered this crisis, but knowing she had no voice in its resolution. She was the problem, not the solution. Hawk found her later, sitting by the stream that ran through the valley. Moonlight turned the water silver, and she watched it flow past with the steady persistence of something that knew its destination. You're thinking of leaving, he said, settling beside her on the bank. I'm thinking of what's right. What's right is protecting family. What's right is not letting them win. She turned to study his profile in the moonlight. The strong jaw, the scar that ran from temple to cheek, the way his hands rested calm and steady on his knees. He was a man who'd learned to carry burdens without complaint, to find strength in the weight of responsibility. Your people didn't ask for this fight, she said quietly. My people have been fighting this fight since the first white man crossed the Mississippi. You didn't start it, and leaving won't end it. The truth of his words settled between them, heavy as the mountain air. This was about more than one woman's worth, more than the simple mathematics of risk and reward. This was about the right to exist, to choose your own path, to protect what you loved. There's something else, Hawk said after a long silence. Something Storm didn't tell the others. She waited, reading the tension in his shoulders, the way he stared into the moving water as if it held answers. The army's not just investigating. They're planning to attack the settlements, blame it on Apache raiders, give them justification for a full military response. The words hung in the night air, terrible in their implications. Innocent people would die, and the blame would fall on the Apache, giving the territorial government the excuse they needed to seize tribal lands. "We have to warn them," Ellie said. "Warn the same people who left you to die in a snowstorm. Warn the children who don't deserve to pay for their parents' sins." Hawk's hands tightened on his knees. She could see the war playing out behind his eyes, duty to his people battling against his sense of justice. It was the same conflict that had driven him to exile, the same impossible choice between loyalty and what was right. If we warn them, we expose ourselves. If we don't, innocent blood will be on our hands. And if we run, we lose everything your people have built here. The stream continued its steady flow, indifferent to human dilemmas. Ellie watched a piece of bark float past, carried by currents it couldn't control toward a destination it couldn't choose. She understood the feeling. What if there was another way? She asked, "What do you mean? What if we could stop the attack without exposing the camp? What if we could turn their own plan against them?" She saw him turn to look at her, his attention sharp and focused. In the moonlight, his expression was unreadable, but she could feel the intensity of his consideration. "You have an idea. I have a question. Who benefits most from a war between the Apache and the territorial government? The people who want Apache land. And who's been pushing hardest for my return? Clayton Thompson." The pieces began to fall into place, forming a picture that made terrible sense. Clayton's insistence on finding her, his connections to territorial officials, his convenient arrival just as the army began planning their false flag operation. "He's not trying to recover stolen money," Ellie said. "He's trying to silence the only person who knows the truth about how he's been stealing from mail-order brides." "What truth?" "That he's been forging marriage contracts, taking dowries from women who think they're coming west to legitimate husbands. When they arrive, he claims they're thieves and keeps their money." The implications hit Hawk all at once. If Clayton was running a systematic fraud, stealing from desperate women and using the territorial government to cover his tracks, then exposing him would destroy the justification for the planned attack. "We need proof," he said. "We need to get back to town. Find the other women he's cheated, get them to testify." "Too dangerous. Clayton's people are watching every approach." "Then we make them come to us." The idea was forming as she spoke, dangerous but possible. They couldn't save everyone by running, but they might be able to save everyone by standing and fighting. Not with guns and violence, but with truth and justice. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking about what Clayton wants most. He wants me silenced, discredited, disappeared. What if we gave him what he wants? Ellie, what if we made him think he'd won, drew him out where we could expose him?" Hawk was quiet for a long moment, turning the idea over in his mind. It was risky, possibly suicidal, but it might be their only chance to save both the Apache camp and the innocent settlers caught in the middle. "It would mean going back," he said finally. "It would mean finishing what we started. We could both die. We could both save the people we love." The stream flowed past them in the moonlight, carrying away the bark and leaves that had fallen into its current. But some things, Ellie thought, were worth holding on to. Some things were worth the risk of drowning. "When do we leave?" Hawk asked. "Tomorrow, before the army reaches the settlements. And if it doesn't work, then at least we tried." They left the valley before dawn, riding 2 horses through the mountain passes toward the settlement. The plan was simple in its desperation. Ellie would signal Clayton's men to her location, leading them into the canyon where Hawk could observe and document their true intentions. The morning sun climbed higher as they descended from the mountains, painting the desert floor in shades of copper and gold. Hawk's eyes constantly scanned the horizon, reading the land for signs of pursuit, for the dust clouds that would signal approaching riders. There, Ellie pointed to a rocky outcrop that overlooked the main trail. I can be seen from there. Hawk studied the terrain with a warrior's eye, noting the angles of approach, the available cover, the escape routes that might save them if the plan went wrong. The rocks offered concealment, but also created a trap, a place where superior numbers could pin them down. You sure about this? He asked. I'm sure about them. Her voice carried the weight of hard-learned wisdom. Men like Clayton always overplay their hand when they think they're winning. She positioned herself on the outcrop, her torn wedding dress replaced by a traveling skirt that would be visible from a distance. The morning breeze caught the fabric, making it flutter against the rocks. A signal fire of human desperation, designed to draw predators from their hiding places. Hawk found concealment in the rocks below, close enough to protect her, but hidden enough to observe. His rifle lay across his knees, loaded but not cocked. This was about gathering information, not starting a war. The weight stretched into the afternoon. Heat shimmered off the desert floor, creating mirages that made distant objects dance and waver. Ellie remained still as carved stone, understanding that patience was as much a weapon as any rifle. When the riders finally appeared, they came fast and hard across the flats. 6 men, led by Clayton Thompson, their horses' hooves throwing up clouds of dust that marked their passage from miles away. They rode with the confidence of men who believed they held all the advantages. Clayton dismounted at the base of the outcrop, his face grim with satisfaction. Behind him, his men spread out in a loose semicircle, cutting off potential escape routes. The movement was practiced, professional, the work of men who'd done this before. Miss Williams, Clayton called up to her. Time to come down and face the consequences of your theft. Ellie rose slowly, her hands visible and empty. I haven't stolen anything, Mr. Thompson. Your family took my dowry and left me to die. Your dowry was payment for services rendered. Food, shelter, transportation. You consumed more than you were worth. The casual cruelty in his voice made Hawk's hands tighten on his rifle. This was how Clayton saw people, as commodities to be bought and sold, as problems to be solved with violence and intimidation. I have proof, Ellie said, her voice carrying across the rocks. Letters from other women you've cheated. Documents showing your fraud. Clayton's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. The relaxed confidence of a man collecting property, replaced by the alertness of someone facing a genuine threat. Where are these supposed documents? Hidden where you'll never find them. But I'll trade them for safe passage and the return of my money. The negotiation continued, but Hawk could see the truth in Clayton's eyes. The man had no intention of honoring any bargain. He was stalling, positioning his men for whatever came next. Here's my counteroffer, Clayton said finally. You come down now, and I'll make your death quick. Keep playing games, and I'll let the boys have some fun first. The mask had fallen away, revealing the predator beneath. Hawk felt his finger move to the rifle's trigger, but forced himself to wait. They needed to hear more, needed evidence that would convince territorial authorities. You can't kill me, Ellie said. Too many people know I'm here. The Apache who rescued me, the territorial marshal who's been asking questions about missing women. What Apache? Clayton's voice sharpened. You mean the savage who took you from the storm? I mean the man who saved my life when your people left me to die. The man who's been helping me document your crimes. Clayton turned to confer with his men, their voices too low to carry to Hawk's position, but their body language spoke volumes. Hands moving to weapons, glances cast toward the surrounding rocks. the subtle shift from capture to combat. "Miss Williams," Clayton called out, his voice taking on a reasonable tone. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. Why don't you come down so we can discuss this properly?" But even as he spoke, Hawk saw two of his men begin circling toward the back of the outcrop. The trap was closing, and Ellie was about to be caught in it. That's when the second group of riders appeared on the horizon. 3 men, moving fast toward their position. Hawk's heart sank as he recognized the lead rider's silhouette. Marcus Thompson, Clayton's younger brother, the man who was supposed to have married Ellie. "Looks like we're about to have a family reunion," Clayton muttered to his men. Marcus reached them minutes later, his horse lathered with sweat from hard riding. He dismounted quickly, his young face flushed with anger and confusion. "Clayton, what the hell is going on?" "I just got word that my bride was taken by Apache raiders." "Why didn't you tell me she'd arrived?" The question hung in the desert air, heavy with implication. Hawk felt the pieces clicking together, the truth revealing itself in Marcus's genuine confusion and concern. "Your bride?" Clayton's voice was carefully neutral. "Marcus, the woman stole money from us. She's a thief and a liar." "What money?" "I sent her travel expenses, nothing more." "Where is she?" Marcus's eyes found Ellie on the outcrop, and his expression shifted to one of recognition and horror. This was not the meeting he'd expected, not the woman he'd been told about. "Miss Williams?" Marcus called up to her. "Are you all right?" "My brother said you'd been taken by hostile Indians." "I was taken by the storm your brother left me in," Ellie replied, her voice carrying clearly in the desert air. "Taken by the Apache who saved my life when your family decided I wasn't worth keeping." The truth hit Marcus like a physical blow. Hawk could see it in the way his shoulders sagged, in the way his gaze shifted between his brother and the woman he'd been corresponding with for months. "Clayton, is this true? Did you turn her away? She wasn't what you ordered, Marcus. Too dark, too fat, too much trouble. I saved you from a mistake." "She wasn't what I ordered?" Marcus's voice rose with each word. "She's a human being, not livestock. I've been writing to her for 6 months, planning a life together." The argument escalated, brother facing brother over the woman they'd both wronged in different ways. But Hawk could see Clayton's men positioning themselves, could read the violence building in their leader's posture. "Enough," Clayton snapped. "She's a problem that needs solving, and you're either with family or against us." "I'm with what's right," Marcus said quietly. That's when Clayton drew his gun, pointing it not at Ellie, but at his own brother. The gesture was casual, practiced, the movement of a man who'd used violence to solve problems before. "Then you're a bigger fool than I thought." The desert went silent, except for the wind moving through the rocks. Hawk's rifle was already rising, his finger finding the trigger. The plan had gone wrong, but the choice was clear. Some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds were impossible. The first shot came from Clayton's gun, aimed at Marcus. The second came from Hawk's position, aimed at Clayton. Both men fell, but the sound of gunfire had shattered the desert silence, and now everyone was moving. Ellie was running, scrambling down the rocks toward the horses. Marcus was crawling toward cover, blood spreading across his shirt. Clayton's men were shouting, firing at muzzle flashes, trying to locate their hidden enemy. The trap had become a battle, and Hawk knew they were outnumbered and outgunned. But as he worked the rifle's action, chambering another round, he felt the familiar calm of a warrior who'd chosen his ground and was prepared to hold it. Some fights were worth having, even when you couldn't win them. The gunfire echoed across the desert like thunder, bringing riders from 3 directions. Storm appeared first, leading a dozen Apache warriors down from the high country. Behind them came Territorial Marshal John Reeves with 2 deputies, drawn by the sound of conflict. From the east, dust clouds marked the approach of Army cavalry, their blue uniforms stark against the red rock landscape. Clayton lay motionless in the dust, his schemes ended by Hawk's rifle. Marcus pressed a bandana to his shoulder wound, his face pale but determined. The remaining hired guns had thrown down their weapons, recognizing the futility of fighting surrounded enemies. "Marshal Reeves," Marcus called out, his voice carrying across the rocks. "I need to report a crime." The marshal dismounted, his weathered face taking in the scene with practiced assessment. Dead man, wounded man, Apache warriors, and a black woman in traveling clothes, standing beside a giant with a rifle. The mathematics of frontier justice were rarely simple. "What happened here, son?" "My brother was running a fraud scheme, stealing from mail-order brides, using territorial connections to cover his tracks." Marcus struggled to his feet, swaying slightly from blood loss. "This woman is one of his victims." Ellie stepped forward, her posture straight despite the ordeal. In her hands, she held a leather satchel that had been hidden in the rocks during the confrontation. "I have documents," she said quietly. "Letters from other women he cheated. Records of money stolen. Proof of his conspiracy with corrupt officials." The marshal accepted the satchel, his expression growing grimmer as he examined its contents. Letters in feminine handwriting, desperate pleas for help, accusations of theft and abandonment. A pattern of cruelty that stretched back years. "This is enough to hang a man," Reeves said finally, "if he wasn't already dead." "There's more," Marcus added, his voice gaining strength. Clayton was working with army officers to stage false Apache attacks. They planned to blame the tribes for violence they created themselves. The approaching cavalry had reached the scene, their captain dismounting to assess the situation. Captain William Hayes was a career soldier, his uniform pressed despite the desert heat, his bearing that of a man accustomed to command. "Marshal," Hayes said with a curt nod. "We heard gunfire. Are there hostile Indians in the area?" "Only if you consider justice hostile," Reeves replied drily. "These Apache helped stop a criminal conspiracy that would have gotten innocent people killed." Storm stepped forward, his English careful but clear. "We come in peace, Captain. We bring evidence of corruption in your ranks." The evidence was damning. Documents showing payment to army officers, plans for false flag operations, maps marking Apache settlements for destruction. The conspiracy reached deeper than any of them had imagined, touching both civilian and military leadership. "These are serious accusations," Hayes said, examining the papers. "If proven true, several officers will face court-martial. And several innocent tribes will keep their lands," Storm added quietly. The negotiations continued as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the desert floor. Justice moved slowly in the territories, but it moved nonetheless. Clayton's hired guns agreed to testify in exchange for reduced sentences. Marcus provided evidence of his brother's criminal network. The Apache offered cooperation in exchange for recognition of their land rights. Through it all, Ellie stood beside Hawk, her presence a quiet anchor in the storm of legal proceedings. They had gambled everything on this moment, and somehow, impossibly, they had won. "What about the woman?" Hayes asked, nodding toward Ellie. "She was reported as kidnapped by Apache raiders." "She was rescued by Apache protectors," Reeves corrected, "after being left to die by the very people who reported her missing." The distinction mattered in territorial law. Rescue was heroic, kidnapping was criminal. The difference between those words would determine whether Hawk faced prosecution or commendation. "I'll need her testimony," Hayes said, "and his full statements about what happened." "You'll have them," Ellie replied, "along with testimony from the Apache who saved my life." The legal proceedings took 3 days, conducted in the small courthouse of the nearest territorial settlement. Ellie testified about Clayton's fraud, about being abandoned in the storm, about the Apache who had chosen to protect rather than exploit her vulnerability. Marcus corroborated her story, his guilt over his brother's crimes evident in every word. Storm spoke for his people, explaining their desire for peace, their willingness to cooperate with territorial authorities, if treated with respect and fairness. The Apache had never wanted war, only the right to live free on land that had belonged to their ancestors for generations. When the testimony concluded, the judge delivered his verdict. Clayton's criminal network was exposed and destroyed. The corrupt Army officers faced court-martial. The Apache gained legal recognition of their water rights and protection from a legal seizure of their lands. But the most significant change was smaller, more personal. Ellie Williams, the woman deemed unsuitable for marriage by people who had never bothered to know her worth, was offered a position as territorial educator. Her job would be to establish schools that served both settler and Apache children, bridging the gap between two worlds that had learned to see each other as enemies. "Will you take it?" Hawk asked as they stood outside the courthouse, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. "Only if you'll help me," she replied. "I'll need someone who understands both worlds, who can translate more than just words." "What about your people, your family back in Georgia?" "This is my family now. This is where I belong." 6 months later, the school stood at the boundary between Apache land and territorial settlement. Children of both cultures learned to read and write, to understand each other's languages and customs. Ellie taught with the passion of someone who had finally found her true calling, while Hawk served as liaison between the Apache Council and territorial government. They had built something neither had imagined possible when he first pulled her from the snow. Not just a school, but a bridge between worlds that had seemed irreconcilably divided. Not just a partnership, but a family forged from shared purpose and mutual respect. The settlement grew around their school, attracting families who wanted their children educated in an atmosphere of tolerance and understanding. Apache and settlers learned to trade fairly, to settle disputes through negotiation rather than violence, to see each other as neighbors rather than enemies. In the evenings, after the last student had gone home, Ellie and Hawk would sit on the porch of their modest house, watching the sun set over the desert they had both learned to love. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the satisfaction of work well done and challenges successfully met. She had traveled west looking for a husband and found something better. A purpose that matched her abilities, a community that valued her contributions, a partner who saw her worth when others had seen only disappointment. He had lived in exile, protecting his people from a distance, and found a way to serve them more effectively than he had ever imagined possible. Through her, he had learned that bridges were stronger than walls, that understanding could accomplish more than force. The desert wind carried the sounds of children playing, of families gathering for evening meals, of a community that had learned to thrive through cooperation rather than conflict. It was the sound of hope made manifest of two broken people who had found healing in helping others find their way. And that is all to the story for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel, and if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you, it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.